Welcome to section 11.3. Now, 11.3 is going to talk about a series of other ways in which genetics kind of differ from the Mendelian pattern. So we've already covered incomplete dominance and codominance, but now we're going to cover a bunch of other ones, including many of them that are chromosomal. So starting off, let's talk about how we determine whether an individual is male or female, so we can talk about some of the ways that affects whether or not you inherit certain traits. So sex chromosomes is going to be one type of chromosome that's found in most organisms. So like we've talked about, humans have 23 sets of chromosomes. One of our sets is going to be called the sex chromosomes. The other 22 sets are called autosomes because they don't code for gender. So what you get for this last set that you get, the sex chromosomes, determines are you male or female. Now in humans, the way this works is if you get two X chromosomes, you're a female. If you get an X and a Y, you're male. So ultimately, it's the Y chromosome that's the determining factor. If you lack it, you're not going to be male. If you have it, you're going to be male. Now, this differs from some other organisms. When you look at things like birds, they're kind of the opposite, where females have a Z and a W, that's just what we call them, but you'll notice they have two different types of chromosomes, much like human males do. Whereas in males, if you're a chicken, you have two Zs. The key to this is, in humans, males determine the gender of the offspring. Because if they give their X, they're going to have a baby girl. If the male gives a Y, you're going to have a son. Whereas in birds, it's actually the female that determines whether it's a boy or a girl based on if she gives a Z or a W. Now, other organisms like insects, it gets even more interesting because sometimes you'll have where males are just haploid, so they only have one set of chromosomes. You see that in certain things like bees and some ants. You'll see that some of them too will have where a male is just an individual that lacks a second sex chromosome. So they essentially have one X and then nothing. They're just like down a chromosome. So I just want you to realize that while we're going to focus on humans yet again, there are lots of ways that you determine gender. There's not like one universal method for gender or one universal gender period that we find throughout the animal and plant kingdoms. What we see instead is throughout all of life, there's lots of different organisms, some of which have up to like 13 different genders. I mean, it can get interesting. But for right now, we're going to focus on humans, where it's going to come down to this idea of boys versus girls. Now, why do we care so much about this? The reason we care so much is because some of our genes that code for critical things other than just genitalia are going to be on sex chromosomes. So we have this other type of linkage, not traditional linkage or autosomal linkage it's sometimes called. That's when two things are on the same chromosome, two genes. We also have sex linkage, where a gene that's vital or important for life is on a sex chromosome. Now there will be disorders where some of these genes that serve a pretty important function that are on these sex chromosomes, sometimes they'll have where an allele develops through mutation or whatever else. Typically it'll be recessive like we talked about before, and it's going to cause problems if you get the wrong version of that allele. So if you're homozygous recessive for that allele, you can have a variety of genetic disorders. Now you might say, we already talked about recessive genetic disorders. We already said how they're common. We already said why they're common. But I want you to realize here, if we're setting up a Punnett square, most of these things are found on the X chromosome, because only males have a Y chromosome, and it really only codes for male stuff. Because if anything vital was on the Y chromosome, females don't have one, so they die. So it would lead to extinction of the species. So pretty much all the genes that are unrelated to gender that are going to be found on a chromosome will be on this X chromosome. So we're going to focus on the X. But the idea here is if we have a trait, red-green color blindness, certain types of hemophilia, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, all of these can cause fairly, we'll say, I don't know if it's horribly severe in the case of color blindness, but definitely noticeable issues with the person in question. Hemophilia can be deadly because you can't clot your blood properly, so it can make it where you essentially bleed to death. Duchenne's muscular dystrophy makes your muscles just waste away, so you're typically in a wheelchair, probably by your teens at least, if not earlier, and you will die somewhere probably in your teens to 20s. So this is going to be a very rough thing to have. This will be fatal. So as we look at a lot of these disorders that we have, if you try to set up a Punnett square, you can't do it the traditional way. We have to set this up where we realize the male is only going to have one X. His Y chromosome will not carry an allele for any of these traits, whereas the female with two X's will pass on one of her traits to any offspring. So males will only pass it on to their female offspring, whereas females pass it on to any of them. So if we were to set this up, let's say for Duchenne's, a male would not be able to reproduce with Duchenne's because they'd be so affected by the time they got to reproductive age, they would not be capable of reproduction. So we can assume that the male is going to have the dominant healthy allele, and then the Y chromosome gets nothing because it doesn't carry an allele for Duchenne's at all, good or bad, normal or affected. So then the female, let's assume that she's healthy because otherwise she couldn't reproduce, and so we'll say she's a carrier though. In this scenario, when you do the actual filling in, you'll see that there's one homozygous dominant healthy female. You'll see the other female will always be healthy because it gets a healthy allele from dad, and so mom gives her unhealthy allele for Duchenne's, so that individual is going to be a carrier, so they could essentially pass it on later, but not now. You'll notice that the male on the bottom here is going to get an affected allele from mom, and because they only get one allele, they don't get a backup chance. This individual will have Duchenne's, so this individual will be affected by Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. The other male would be unaffected. So you can see right here, there is a 25% chance that a child gets Duchenne's, kind of like we're used to. But that child will always be a male. So there's a 50% chance that you will get this disorder if your mother's a carrier. If you're a boy, there's a 0% chance if you're a girl. And that's really what a lot of this sex linkage comes down to, is your gender affects your odds. So in this case, if you're female, there's going to be a 0% chance that you'll be affected. If you are male, there's going to be a 50% chance. And so that's the key idea here. Gender suddenly matters, especially when we're coming up with probabilities. For X-linked recessive traits, it's mostly males that are affected by these things. When you look at red-green color blindness, it's about 90% males that are affected. Hemophilia, mostly males for the cases of hemophilia that are X-linked recessive. Now, if this did happen to be dominant, it would affect mostly females because they have 2 chances to get a dominant, whereas males only have 1. But there's very, very, very few issues that we see on the X chromosome that are dominant. So generally speaking, if you're looking at a pedigree, if you're looking at something's family history, and you see a trait that affects almost all males, there's a good chance it's not just recessive because it skips a generation here and there, but it's sex-linked or X-linked recessive, and that would account for the fact that males are disproportionately affected. So when you see like probably 80% or more of those that get the disease, or in some cases like Duchenne's, only males get the disease, because for a female to get the disease, the mom must be at least a carrier to pass on 1D, in this case little d, recessive, and the dad would also have to have the trait. So in other words, for a female to have colorblindness, she would have to have a mother that's at least a carrier, and she would have to have a father that is colorblind. He would have to suffer from it. And so because of this, it's much harder for a female to get it. It's not impossible as long as the male lives and can reproduce, but it's much more unlikely.